Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros. Today, I am speaking with Anya Leonard. Anya is the founder of Classical Wisdom, which you can find at classicalwisdom.com. It's also on Substack, and they have a wealth of articles and resources on ancient wisdom, including Stoicism, but also much broader than that. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you.
Well, I thought we would discuss some philosophies that are related, adjacent to Stoicism, and someone who you've been writing some pieces on recently, Heraclitus. Perhaps a name some of the listeners might be familiar with, perhaps not, but I think seeing the connections between his thought, we know about his thought, and Stoicism can be very fruitful. So let's start from the top. Who was Heraclitus, and maybe even on the personal side, what sort of stands out about the man to you?
Well, thank you again to sort of open up the conversation to some of the broader ancient philosophies. I usually like to say that Stoicism is sort of like a gateway drug to other ancient philosophies. And it's very exciting sometimes when you start to learn about Stoicism to find out that there's so much more interesting philosophy that can be impactful in one's life, and to see the influences these philosophies have had on Stoicism. And Heraclitus is one of those. I mean, he has a very direct impact both on the founder of ancient Stoicism, Zeno of Citium, as well as much more later Stoics. So for those who want a brief introduction to who Heraclitus was, he lived, around the 500 BC mark, and he was in the city of Ephesus in what is modern-day Turkey, in Asia Minor. And at that time he was living, it was actually under rule by the Persian Empire. And Heraclitus was a very interesting fellow. He was quite obscure in his writings, and he was very cryptic. And he also was kind of famously a misanthropic. He was sort of described as wandering the hills by himself, just nourishing himself on the plants. And he did write one work that we know of, which he left at the temple of Artemis, and that was referred to by a lot of other ancient philosophers. Sadly, that text has been lost to us today. But we have so many of his ideas and concepts preserved through quotations and references from later philosophers. And some of them got him, some of them didn't. Aristotle complained about him. Socrates said, and I love this quote, he says, "The part I understand is excellent, and so too, I dare say, the part I do not understand, but it needs a Delian diver to get to the bottom of it." So Heraclitus kind of wrote these very, yes, obscure quotes, and one might recognize him today as one of those rare accomplishments of passing into modern parlance with "you cannot step in the same river twice." And one of the best quotes for that one is, "On those who step into the same rivers, different waters flow." So this kind of concept of change being very fundamental to who Heraclitus was.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can see that, thinking of change in particular, you can see that in remarks by Marcus Aurelius, like the universe is transformation, life is opinion. I think he has a number of lines that harken back to Heraclitus's view of the world, perhaps as flux, as it's often captured. I know there's some perhaps complications around to what extent that is accurate or might be overplayed, but I think that's one way in which Heraclitus influenced Stoic metaphysics, is this idea of change.
Yes, certainly. So, I mean, Heraclitus really felt that the cosmos was in a constant state of flux, and that flux is everything's changing, but it's not only changing; it's becoming its opposite. And this kind of concept to us, we can relate to in a very real and anecdotal manner when we think, your hot tea becomes cold life becomes death. The seasons are constantly changing. I mean, it's something very real and tangible that we experience. And not only is that change constant externally, that change can even be constant internally. Like our opinions change depending on where we are in our lives and everything. But this chaos and at times tension, because he said war is the king of all, because it
Hmm.
makes some men kings and some men slaves. And he also said strife is justice. And to our sort of modern minds, we would think, oh no, we're kind of more conflict averse. We're like, why would this be a good thing? But it is through these tensions that order and harmony are found. And he uses a couple of examples for that, specifically the lyre, the ancient sort of harp, and showing that the tension of the strings is where the music comes from. And similarly, the bow and arrow, the bow only works because of this tension. And Heraclitus, just for those who are sort of interested in the language of his writing, he makes so many basically puns and word plays. So in each fragment, he has it, they're beautiful to hear in the ancient Greek, but they also work on so many layers, with regards to like the word for arrow also being the word for life. I mean, bow and life. So
Hmm.
he's somebody that a few fragments you can spend a lifetime contemplating. But where it relates to Stoicism more specifically is that this flux, this change, this tension kind of results in something that he thought called the logos, which is sort of
Hmm.
this rational, ordering principle in the world. And this is definitely something that the Stoics sort of adopted wholesale. They saw the universe as a single living rational organism that was permeated by divine reason, this logos. And so this is definitely something that the Stoics felt Heraclitus really got right, like a metaphysical understanding that nature is dynamic but ordered, and what happens and what follows is sort of reason and necessity. So this kind of aspect that the world kind of makes sense even if we don't know how.
Yeah. How does that make sense? I think perhaps the first pass you might understand Heraclitus is saying, change is constant. Everything is changed in a fundamental way. You can't step into the same river twice. What was scattered gathers, what was gathered blows apart. It's one of my favorite fragments of his. And yet he still believes things are ordered in a fundamental way, at least with this account of the logos. Yeah, how do you make sense of that?
Well, I mean, it's something that actually follows with a more scientific understanding of how nature works, and I think he's been vindicated in this in a lot, that like you might look at a forest and just see something that looks completely irrational and unreasoned, like just a natural forest, and there's leaves everywhere and there's trees, and it hasn't been made into a garden. It's just nature as it is. But if you look into it, you'll see leaves growing out with the Fibonacci sequence, or you'll see that these cycles go and exist. So it's actually like the theory of natural order, that we can find governing laws underneath this chaos. That it's the spiral in the galaxy, the spiral in our DNA. That these patterns and shapes and kind of universal truths exist, even if we don't know them at that time. And when you think about a lot of the original ancient philosophies, they, their world was not so siloed as ours is today.
Hmm.
We like to put math over here and philosophy over here and biology over here, and keep them really separate as distinct categories. But for the original philosophers, they were scientists as well and mathematicians as well. And I think it was over the Plato's Academy that said, "No man who doesn't know geometry enter here." That these were sort of natural scientists, and so they're trying to make sense of their world. And philosophy and understanding and perceiving the world were very much part of that. So it does have sort of a logic to it. I mean, where of course the word like logos comes from as well. That we're of trying to understand the world even when we perceive it as chaos.
Yeah, or perhaps an order emerges from chaos. Perhaps you can think of it as emergent order. Might be one
Yeah,
gloss on it.
that and it's amazing with emergent qualities. There's so many times that we see it and don't understand it, and I think anyone who's spent a lot of time seeing a child grow up will see this, where they're speaking at first and it's just little babbling sounds, and the sounds start to make more shape, and then all of a sudden the language like becomes clear. And when we learn or any language as adults, we think of it like, first we have to learn one word after another, and we have to build grammar, and we have to like approach it in this sort of rational way. But actually, when you see language appear naturally, it just sort
Mhm.
of comes up, just like teeth come down. It's sort of all at once in a way that is awe-inspiring personally, but we don't always see it until it happens.
Yeah, I think so. That's something that's, I suppose, an important theme is that we don't always see the order or don't understand how things are ordered, and as such, perhaps make mistaken judgments about the world. I think that reminds me of Marcus Aurelius's remarks about the flecks of foam on a boar's mouth, or the cracks in a loaf of bread, and about if you saw how these things fit together into the larger whole, these parts fit together in a larger whole, then you would understand the beauty of these kinds of phenomena.
Well, and there's that very popular parable with if you had several blind men touching an elephant, and at different parts of the elephant, they would have no idea what they were looking at. I mean, if you're just touching a tusk, you would think it was a very different animal than if you were touching the tail or the legs. And they can't see the full animal. They can only see the little small part they have. And that's, I think, a really good analogy for, or a metaphor for, how a lot of us experience the world. Like we only see the part that we see. We don't necessarily see how it fits into a larger whole, nor necessarily can we. But that's
Mhm.
maybe that gets to the Stoics versus the Skeptics. I should save that for later.
Very good. Well, one other question I had about Heraclitus' picture of the world, I suppose, is so the Stoics, they see the world's fundamentally ordered and it has a kind of providence purpose to it. Would you say Heraclitus is similar in that regard, or um,
I don't know as much with the providence or even fate. I think it's a it's less complete. I mean, the
mhm,
other thing, just to say again, we don't have as much of a full picture of
right?
what Heraclitus felt than as we do with Stoicism. So there will be elements where we have gaps because there's so few of his ideas that are extant tragically today. So it's in a lot of what we have, as I was saying, are fragments, and even of those fragments, a lot of them are hard to really fully understand what he was saying. And as a sort of funny concept is that even in the ancient world, even when his works were fully available, before the Library of Alexandria burned down, there was philosophers who would say, "Yes, Heraclitus is sort of like reading. It's like really brilliant, and then it feels like he's just not. He didn't finish it. It's like he just sort of mumbles the second half." So, but I like to give Heraclitus, the benefit of the doubt, and I like to think that he really wanted to make people work for it to understand
Hmm.
these ideas, and he didn't write just for everybody. He really wanted people to earn the wisdom and to put in the effort to get there. And I use sometimes like a modern example of that is if you've read Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury or Nabokov's Ada or Adore. I mean, the first 50 pages of it are near impossible to get through, and he's weeding everybody out purposefully. So I think Heraclitus was similar in that regard, where it was a fine line between poetry and philosophy. I mean, well, I shouldn't say there was a line at all. They're completely intertwined with his works. So you do have to figure it out a little bit. And there's lots of debate still.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's both a aspect where we only have fragments of Heraclitus's work, and then, as you say, perhaps even if we had the complete picture, there's a cryptic, poetic nature to his thought that engenders controversy, and also I think is rich. I think something worth thinking over for a lifetime or two, as you said.
And one thing I think that is very strikingly similar to Heraclitus and the Stoics is to see that tension and strife as a pathway, So, as I was saying before, this sort of tension creates harmony. It's supposed to be difficult because it will make it more meaningful. That these challenges are purposeful and necessary at times. So, I definitely think that is an element where they have a very large crossover.
Hmm. I think so. Related to that, I suppose, how do you make sense of some of these fragments, like justice in our mind is strife? We cannot help but see war makes us as we are. How do you make sense of those?
So there's a few things to this. In the time period in which Heraclitus was living, I mean, he would have seen a lot of war.
Hmm.
He had seen Darius take over the Persian Empire, sort of roll through this Greek colony, and his life would have had constant war. So for him, war was a reality. It was not something that we fortunately nowadays think, okay, I mean, it's still extremely tragic, but it can happen. We can live our whole lives without being in a war. You can have your parents live a whole life without being in a war. That was just not a possibility for Heraclitus. So war and strife were inevitable. And so instead of it just seeing the destruction of it, it
Hmm.
is what comes afterwards. And so in some ways, when empires come through, they create these orders that did not exist beforehand. Something that the Romans would have felt as well. But so this element of strife is very, very real. But I sort of hinted before too at the idea that in some ways he is the origins of relativism, in that our perception changes as well. And this is another one that anecdotally we can relate to. Whereas, for instance, a cold glass of water when you're really hot means a lot more to you. Feeling well after being sick, you value it more. So for him, he does bring up a lot of these ideas that our experience of um, change is also internal as well as external. So strife is part of war, but it's also in our own lives. How much more do we
Hmm.
appreciate our friends or families if we've had conflict? And conflict is necessary. And another way that I think, I mean, one thing I always try to do at Classical Wisdom is to take these ideas and put them sort of firmly in the modern world and realm so that they're very relatable and we understand how they work. And I think, in a way, to see this importance of strife and conflict is to see the history of philosophy or science itself. Everybody has an idea and then they have to have a contrasting idea. And these theories, the entire scientific process is that of critique, conflict. You think of, there's so many examples. And same thing with philosophy. Socrates had his ideas, Plato contrasted or rejected some of them. Then Aristotle rejected Plato, and we kind of go back and forth until we create something. Art too is a history of conflict and creation, conflict and creation. So this idea of strife is more important to us than we might originally think.
Yeah, I think so. That's a great point. That's perhaps uh, most of us avoid strife, conflict whenever we can, but it's a necessity to ordinary life, and certainly is perhaps hidden behind many of our normal interactions. Just always just below the surface, or the possibility of more serious conflict makes makes society what it is.
I think it's also worthwhile for us to sometimes take a step back at the words that we have translated today and see
Hmm.
them and their modern connotations. I think strife sounds very negative to us, whereas debate or contention at times would be more applicable. And you think about the founding of the United States of America is very much a huge series of debates and arguments between, should the government be large or small? Should we have central bank or not? I mean, anybody who's watched Hamilton will remember this, if not read the history books. So these series of debates and conflicts are absolutely fundamental rather than just being a fight. Now, it is interesting because in the ancient Greek, strife relates directly to Eris, who is the goddess of kind of chaos, who is the true originator of the entire Trojan War when
Hmm.
she throws a golden apple into a wedding and causes a fight between Hera and Aphrodite and Athena. So it's kind of it's funny to think that in their world there's even a goddess to embody this sort of originator of what goes on to become the greatest epic in their mythology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose before we think about some other philosophers, are there any particular fragments that stand out to you from Heraclitus that you find exceptionally either beautiful or provocative? Sure.
Well, one that I think your listeners will like the most comes from is fragment. I think it's 116. Is to be sound minded, the greatest excellence and wisdom, to say and do true things, giving heed according to nature. And I can definitely see a nice Stoic overlap with one living according to nature, and that going back to logos and seeing that nature, but also that to be sound minded in wisdom is also rooted in virtue and
Hmm.
doing good things and being excellent. So that's the Eva Braun translation. I'm a big Eva Braun fan, so I thought I'd go with that one.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, it sounds like a Stoic. You've got the living accordance with the nature and this idea of knowledge, perhaps grounding what is most virtuous. You mentioned the division between the Stoics and the Skeptics, and I think perhaps that ties nicely to some of what we've been talking about with Heraclitus, where Heraclitus you have or this the chaos, flux, and so on that can be understood both in the I suppose the fancy philosophical word is metaphysics at the level of this is the way things are; they truly are chaotic, but also at the level of what we believe, epistemology, and such. We see things as in constant flux, and it shapes our beliefs. And I think perhaps of course the Stoics and the skeptics have different responses to the uncertainty that this engenders. So I wonder if you could speak to the skeptics and the conflict between them and the Stoics.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was saying to you before we started that with classical wisdom, one of the things we try to do is encapsulate the full broad range of the classical world, which is quite massive. I mean, it seems like it's going to be niche, but we kind of cover Hadrian's Wall down to North Africa, across to India from around 12,000 BC, sometimes up to about 500 AD. And I love it because it can give a broad overview. But it does mean that there are definitely niches that are so precise. And I find the Stoic movement, and Stoicism, absolutely fascinating, and I've been loving its renaissance
Mhm.
culturally, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. But there are definitely going to be elements of Stoicism that your listeners will be more knowledgeable than me if that's this specific interest. Whereas I will say I'm a big fan of skepticism. So perhaps in this one, well, no, I'm not gonna put out my position yet because I'm gonna conclude elsewhere. So the skeptics, like Stoicism, like Skepticism, like Cynicism, and like Epicureanism, the word of the philosophy has a very different connotation in meaning today. And I love that I think Stoicism has been able to recapture that word away from this sort of very narrow cultural perception that it used to have. And skepticism still has some legwork to do on this. So, your modern person is probably going to think skeptics, they just maybe like they're the crazy people who only watch, the History Channel after midnight and nothing is real and who built the pyramids and things like that. Which, there's a certain level of that. I'm like, yes, question everything. Great. But also, skepticism more philosophically is about how can we know what we know, and how can we trust our senses? Is what we see going to be how we determine knowledge, or is it through just our mind? And this is a very important debate that goes straight up to Kant and the Copernican revolution. So it's a very critical question to study, as you say, epistemology. How do we know what we know? And the skeptics were pretty solidly on the category of we can't know what we know. And there's more extreme levels of it, and the most extreme is we can never know what we know. I mean, and we can't know anything. So this school of skepticism, it kind of initiated with a writer, Philo, who was writing in the 4th century BC, and this became more of a philosophy much later on in the 1st century BC, but it had mostly survived through the works of Sextus Empiricus around the 3rd century CD, and it's really at its heart a practice of suspending judgment. And it's sort of just a series of understanding how we can accept that we can't really know much. And you can think of Socrates saying, I do not claim to know that which I do not know. Like there's a level of skepticism that I think is absolutely essential for learning anything, because it's going to be impossible to learn something if you think you know it. So accepting that we do not know that which we do not know is 100%, I think, the first step in kind of achieving wisdom. Um, and the Stoics had an understanding of how they can know, and this is where I think maybe you might be more knowledgeable than me in this with regards to the process in which they felt that they knew, which I believe was catalepsis, and that was
Mhm.
like a series of impressions that you had to choose what was right and what was wrong. And then afterwards, there was like an assent to which you could say, I now understand this. And so the Stoics certainly felt that it was achievable to know what is good and right and virtuous. And the skeptics did not think that was possible.
Right. I think there is a fundamental agreement between the two where they both have this idea that it's our judgments that cause so much suffering, and then perhaps a slightly different response to that fact. I think both schools have the insight that our desires are frustrated, but often our desires depend on our beliefs, our value judgments, and we can either withhold. If we suspend judgment, often that's the best thing to do, and one of the best ways to address suffering. But as you say, I think uh, despite sharing what we might call today a sort of skeptical attitude towards our impressions, appearances, the skeptics sort of take it all the way, whereas the Stoics want to say, no, at the end of the day, some knowledge is possible. We can know what's good, some facts about the world, and so on.
Well, what I like at the end is, Epictetus, he respected the skeptics as a very worthy opponent. He saw them as a useful challenge, and I think that kind of, to bring it sort of full circle to Heraclitus, is that you need sometimes challenge in order to refine your ideas. And if they're never challenged, then how do you know those ideas are good? I mean, how do you need that conflict? And so Epictetus, was very respectful of the skeptics and what they brought. And I think there was one thing that they were influentially positive for the Stoics was sort of an intellectual humility, and that's kind of critical to live by reason and evidence without
Hmm.
presuming infallibility. So I can see that as being very, very useful. And I think, to me, there's, if I may, two quotes from Epictetus that actually, one of these is my favorite quote of basically almost the entire ancient world that I just absolutely love. But the first one goes to the problem of the skeptics, which is, if you suspend judgment on everything, you will move neither toward nor away from anything, but you will die of hunger and thirst. So I can see for Epictetus specifically the issue with skepticism as a whole from the sort of philosophical position is it's a self-defeating position. You can't just say you know nothing and never will. And
Hmm.
so the conclusion, and I think this I like this one, is, for what is the professed object of reasoning? To state the true, to eliminate the false, and to suspend judgment in doubtful cases. And so I think the skepticism initially is to suspend judgment when you do not know. That is the important takeaway from skepticism, that we need to be able to say we don't know. We need to question what we don't know or how we know things. But when we then learn and test that, then we can eventually come to what we believe is true and what is also false. Yeah, they're both in discourses, but in different books. So,
Hmm.
but I like that one is more specifically to the skeptics, but the second one is sort of a much better encapsulation, I think, of the Stoics, how to approach understanding while incorporating a little element of that skepticism.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think the sort of practical advice Epictetus gives in different places does seem almost like initially skeptical advice. Just refrain from making mistakes. Imagine putting a guardian in front of every impression that occurs, and don't let anything pass you that shouldn't, and so on. And that can be a matter of just simply suspending judgment.
I like it when sort of rooting it into our here and now to bring up the fact that we have a lot of really intense current events and political polarization and very heated discussions that happen a lot. And there's a lot of time an event happens, and we're sort of encouraged to take a very strong stance on what has happened immediately, right when it's happened, right before. There's no way you could possibly know everything that you need to know. But at that moment, you're supposed to declare what side you're on, change your flag on social medias, or do whatever it is that to like signify to the world that you're in this position with regards to whatever it is that has just happened or is the topic du jour that is very heated. And it might be something as silly as, some supermodels jeans ads or something as fundamental as ongoing conflict. But I think the value of skepticism is to take a step back and, before stating your position, actually wondering how much you know on the topic. Because there's a lot of times we think we know a lot more than we do, and that these whatever the issue is much more
Hmm.
complicated. So I think incorporating a bit of skepticism, what do you know and how do you know it, is a great first question before committing oneself to a position.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think there you're often there's some amount of social pressure to come to some judgment in response to some blurry video or something of this sort, but often that's unwarranted. And I think even in our own personal lives, we might have some initial reaction to something someone did, but how much do you know about that actual situation is always a fruitful question. What the other person's intentions were, and so on. One exercise I love from the skeptics here is this equipollence of opposites, I suppose, as a sort of exercise of, if you think you have knowledge about some situation, or if you have some belief that you're clinging to tightly, think of the opposite and hold those two in your mind, both the affirmation and the denial. And often you'll come to see that they have a kind of perhaps that forces you to move to a more agnostic position or to suspend judgment, at least decrease one's confidence in the initial belief.
And then again, to go back to Heraclitus, my man, it's also, if you realize that any position, anything that's happening is constantly changing and constantly becoming its opposite, then how strong is that position if you know
Mm.
it's in a state of flux?
Yeah, I think that's a deep point. There's, if you think about, I suppose, knowledge, our beliefs often so limited to a certain point of time, and that might change. And maybe you think, oh, now you can't change your mind, but the world's very complicated, and our beliefs probably ought to change quite a lot as the world does.
Correct. I would definitely agree with that.
Um, well, I think maybe another fun place to go to thinking about um, opposites, these conflicts between different schools, is Seneca loves to talk about another school, the Epicureans. Sometimes he mentions them so much, Epicurus in particular, so much in his letters that you wonder if it's a little bit of a giveaway to his Stoic credentials. But I wonder if you could speak to how you find the Epicureans as a philosophy, what you find most interesting or fruitful when it comes as it comes to a tradition where one can mine wisdom from.
Well, as I mentioned before, with regards to Stoic, Cynics, all these terms, Epicurus is another one that really doesn't have to do with food blogging, and yet is what we kind of think of these days. So it is another ancient philosophy that was sort of based on the teachings of Epicurus, and he's from around 340 BC on the island of Samos, and the Epicureans, they were in some ways very like a lot of the pre-Socratics with regards to being autonomists and
Mhm.
materialists, and he was very much influenced by Democritus, and they were very much against superstition and divine intervention. So there were certain elements to it that wouldn't really align with Stoicism, and that predominantly the biggest conflict would be the idea of pleasure. And they kind of followed the tradition of hedonism a bit more in regards to holding happiness. Pleasure is sort of the main goal rather than virtue. So that's a major conflict with the Stoics. One thing that I think is very important to distinguish is that when we think of hedonism, and by extension Epicureanism, we think of pleasure without consequence. So we just imagine gluttony, drinking for as much, or drugs, or just absolute the highest extents of this experience of seeking pleasure. But that was not the ancient philosophy. The ancient philosophy was much more calculated about seeing pleasure. So they would say, okay, you want to feel pleasure, but the second that pleasure will change into pain, you shouldn't do it anymore. So it's fine to drink a glass of wine and enjoy it. But if you have 4 bottles and you wake up the next day with a raging headache, that is no longer pleasure. That is pain. So that is
Mhm.
against Epicurean philosophy. You're about finding that balance, and it's very calculated in finding that balance. So it's much more controlled and thoughtful than I think our preconceived notions about this philosophy is. And if you realize that, then you can see then how Seneca and other more Stoic leaning philosophers later on found a great deal of value in Epicureanism, because it was more about finding tranquility and peacefulness. And so, again, that's another one where we have to sort of distinguish the words. And so, it's not just pleasure, it's specifically atraxia, which is like a tranquility and an absence of pain, and
Mhm.
as well as aponia, which is an absence of specifically bodily pain. So again, you definitely don't want to get hungover, because that would be causing you pain. And similarly, if you eat too much, then you will also be in pain. So it was more focus on enjoying simple pleasures and having a life of simplicity that was rewarding. So a perfect example I've always thought of encapsulating an Epicurean value, if I may, is noticing when you're drinking your cup of coffee that it's exactly the right temperature. And that's a simple, easy pleasure. And it's a daily pleasure. It's something small that we can all do. And I think there's a great deal of value in everyone's life, modern and ancient, in taking moments and appreciating, being grateful, and enjoying small, simple pleasures. And so for the for me at least, that's one of my biggest takeaways that I like. For Seneca, he also said that he really appreciated the sort of putting a value on those simple daily things,
Mhm.
and specifically there was a huge commitment to friendship,
Yep.
which Seneca was a big fan of. There's a commitment to moderation, which again works very well with Stoicism, and this idea of inner peace. So I think he quotes Epicurus mostly for moral from his moral letters, and that's again,
Mhm.
and in those letters, Epicurus advises simplicity, the cultivation of calm, and appreciation of daily life. But I do love that, Seneca was like, I think he said, we're Stoics, but we're allowed to take a few lessons from the enemy's camp. So I think there's a value in acknowledging eclecticism. And I think, while Seneca was most certainly a Stoic, I think he felt he could enrich Stoicism by taking
Mhm.
some lessons from other ancient philosophies, and he also found value in cynicism, as well as Platonism and other philosophies. So he absorbed a lot of the ancient philosophies.
Yeah, he certainly did. We're perhaps always of two minds on this podcast. It's always good fun to poke at the Epicureans a bit as philosophical rivals, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that tradition, and Epicureans and Stoicism today, perhaps in their modern instantiations, are more similar than they are different, apart from some fundamental philosophical disagreements. I suppose I've a Stoic frame on what's useful about the Epicureans that I've toyed with a little bit is that, of course, the Stoics don't think life is all about pleasure, but you could sort of see the Epicurus in particular, as an expert on pleasure, and it's certainly something that's preferable. And he tells you how to pursue it well, which is a part of any ordinary and good human life. Even if, according to Stoics, of course, it's not what life is all about.
I think the one big contrast is their views on politics as well. Like the
True.
Stoics were certainly, it's important to be involved with politics and how the human society is run. Where the Epicureans really were like, we can just exit from this. We're just going to opt out fully. We're going to live in our peaceful communities with our friends and not get involved with the messier side of politics. And I'll be honest, there's definitely times when I can see both aspects of that. There's definitely times where like it might be nice just to take a break from it all and go to the mountains and hang out with your buddies.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's also I think that's great to bring up, and something I've also wondered about from the Stoic perspective is, look, most of these Stoics were talking to effectively Roman aristocrats, nobles, and such who had a chance of becoming serious political players. But would they have the same message for people today whose political power is nowhere near the level of someone who had a chance of holding a serious office? Perhaps their advice might look more like the Epicureans for the typical person. I don't know.
That's an excellent point. And yes, because now we can be reading and understanding philosophy anywhere in the world from any social position and social background without having to. I mean, maybe it's even more torturous if you have to feel like you should be involved in politics, but it's out of your control. Then maybe
Mhm.
it's better to embrace what you have and value your friendships in your day to day life.
Yeah, I suppose so. Or perhaps there's some politics worth becoming involved in, others not, and so on. That's yeah, that's an important question. Awesome. Well, we've leafed through quite a lot, blitzed through three different schools, I suppose, to the Stoics. Um, is there anything else you want to touch on?
I would like, if I may, to talk a little bit about the nature of eclecticism and the kind of, I like to call it the art of cherry picking in a way. And I do think it's interesting because while Seneca did a little bit of that,
Mm-hmm.
Cicero was very, very famously an eclectic. And I do think that there's a huge value in spending a little time being steeped in other philosophies to both assure oneself in the positions that they do feel strongly in and have that tension so that you have that resolution, as well as to find places that where they other philosophies might be useful. And I think it's very valuable with regards to having prep different philosophies for different times in one's life or for different reasons. So as you say, like there's different moments when you're old or young, or you're raising a child, or you're in military service. At different times, we're going to require different tools. And I like to kind of, if it, maybe it's a tired metaphor, but I do see philosophy is sort of a toolbox, and there are different tools that are necessary for different
Mm-hmm.
times. So I think it's certainly valuable. And I often like to think actually of Zeno Citium being one of the OGs of eclecticism, because he really was synthesizing a lot of philosophy that was going around with cynicism and Socrates, and from that founded Stoicism. So I think that tradition of understanding different standpoints and seeing what works and what doesn't work is a long and storied tradition.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. And it is interesting to think about Zeno as an eclectic, and perhaps you see, as we were just talking about, Seneca and his interaction with the Epicureans, but also, of course, Marcus Aurelius. Sometimes people note how Platonic some of his meditations sound, and I think you see uh, the necessity of wrestling with other philosophies, exploring other philosophies for all of these figures, really, who are at some level eclectics, even if they don't reach the level of Cicero. We did cover Cicero's On Ends earlier this year as a sort of short podcast series, so I definitely encourage listeners to check out Cicero in particular. I think he's a rich, absolutely rich, both historical and philosophical resource that we're lucky to have.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. I think he's fascinating. And with all of these different philosophers, they're also responding to different times in history. So in our own world, wherever you're located, or listeners are located, and the world is changing. Again, back to Heraclitus, always changing. You can definitely draw inspiration from different philosophers who are facing different challenges, and see how they responded to them. So it's Cicero does definitely bring together a lot, though. And if you were to get a sort of a one-stop shop for understanding a lot of philosophy, Cicero is a great place to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. Well, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. If you found this conversation useful, please give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you use, and share it with a friend. And I'd like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. Do check out his work at ancientlyre.com, and please get in touch with us at stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback or questions. Until next time.